and today we're going to talk about frogs, which is pretty neat. To be honest, before I started doing research for this, I thought frogs are pretty cool, but whatever. And then in the middle, I was like, frogs are super interesting. Everyone needs to know about them. So I'm going to tell you everything that I learned. So frogs are amphibians, and amphibians are small vertebrates. So they're small animals that have a skeleton, and they need to have water or like a moist environment to live in. So you'll see them around ponds, around puddles, and we will get to different places that they live after. But there are frogs and toads and newts and salamanders in that group. And a lot of people wanted to know the difference between frogs and toads, so I'll definitely tell you about that. The really neat thing about amphibians is there's 3,900 different types of amphibians in the world. 400 of them are actually frogs. But that number is always growing because frogs live all over the world except for Antarctica, and we keep on finding new frogs. Frogs are one of the really neat animals that we just haven't discovered all of them yet, because sometimes they get really, really small, and they live in maybe one tree their whole life. And so we just don't know that that frog exists yet. So like we've learned about narwhals and about bats, there's all kinds of stuff that we don't know about the natural world. So it's really great to be curious. It's so important to ask questions, because then we can grow up and we can learn even more about these animals. So people wanted to know the difference between a frog and a toad. There are tons of differences between them, but the easiest ones to kind of know are frogs have generally two bulging eyes. So they have the big eyes on top of their heads. It's important to know that they're bulging later. They have strong, long, webbed rear feet. They do a lot of jumping and they do a lot of swimming. So sometimes toads do a lot of walking, and they don't do so much swimming. So they don't have to have such long back legs, and they don't have to be webbed either. So if you see something that you're not really sure what one it is, webbed, probably going to be a frog. Another really cool thing is you can tell the difference between frog and toad eggs based on where they are in the pond. And so frog eggs generally are in, and I'm going to show a picture of this later, they're generally in just big kind of like cloudy clumps in ponds, where toads lay their eggs in big ribbons that are through the ponds. So you shouldn't touch them, but if you are looking around ponds, you're looking around water sources, and you see just a big cluster of eggs, probably going to be frogs later, which is pretty cool. And if you see ribbons, they're going to be toads later. Like I said, frogs live on every continent except for Antarctica, although maybe they do. We just haven't discovered, Arctic, subarctic, Antarctic frogs that live under the sea ice. Maybe. And frogs have been around for 265 million years, which is pretty neat. So it tells us that frogs live on every single continent because they've been around for so long. It means that the frogs that live in Central Africa are going to be very different from the frogs that live in Alaska. They live in both places, but they have lived there for so long that they've evolved in really amazing ways just to live there, which is pretty cool. Now, another thing about frogs versus toads is frogs generally have like slimy skin, and their skin is so interesting. We are going to talk about all the different cool things about it, but it's slimy because they live mostly in water, where toads live mostly kind of by water, but by drier areas. And frogs will also, they will sweat out different slimy things in their skin, which is pretty cool, where toads don't like that. They like to be kind of dry. Frogs also sometimes have top teeth, or they have teeth on the roof of their mouth. That's really neat because We've all seen pictures of frogs that they use their tongue to get their prey because they eat moths or grasshoppers or mosquitoes or flies. Now, they don't have, their tongue doesn't do the grabbing. They have slimy outsides, kind of slimy insides, and their saliva, once they hit the mosquito or the fly, their saliva, their spit, is so slimy, it brings it back into their mouth. And then they kind of just chomp down on the fly once, and then they swallow it basically whole. So remember when I said that the frogs have bulgy eyes? So the amazing thing about their bulgy eyes is a frog will use their very sticky tongue. They will catch a fly, put it in their mouth, chomp down on their front teeth, and then they're going to use their big bulgy eyes. They put their bulgy eyes into their head, into their mouth, and that's how they swallow, which is weird and cool. So instead of just swallowing, gulp, they swallow with their eyes pushing their food down. So they go gulp, and it goes all the way down, which is a pretty neat thing for an animal to do. So their eyes are good for looking and for swallowing. Frogs are carnivorous. Like I said, they eat flies, mosquitoes, moths, dragonflies. Some bigger frogs will eat small snakes or smaller frogs, and really any like insects like worms or grasshoppers that they find. They're, pardon me. Oh, sorry. So this gets to their amazing skin. Their skin is really, really cool, and it's why living around water is so important for them. Frog skin has to stay nice and slimy and moist, because not only does it just feel better to have nice skin, nice dewy skin, but they also absorb a lot of their nutrients through their skin. So they absorb water and moisture, they absorb different vitamins, and sometimes they also breathe through their skin. So when they are spending a lot of time in water, they actually are able to absorb the water in their skin, and their skin can change some of the water into oxygen for them. So they still breathe through their nose and mouth, but they're just absorbing so much through their wet skin, which is pretty neat. So they do have like kind of a mucousy slime that goes all over them. So they're able to absorb things all the time. It's much easier to absorb things when you're nice and dewy rather when you're a little bit too dry. It's sort of like your nose. If your nose gets too dry on the inside, it's a bit hard to breathe. It doesn't feel good. You want it just, you know, nice and clean up in there. So sometimes that's a pond. Sometimes they live in trees, and in like the crooks of trees, there will be a little puddle in there. And sometimes it's just dew. But if you think about how small some of the smallest frogs are, a little piece of dew is actually quite a lot for them. So looking at how little they are and how they're everywhere, they really get by, which is nice. Now, their skin is so important and they absorb so much. This is why it's important not to touch frogs. So last week, we talked about not touching bats. You don't put a bat in your mouth and then you don't get sick. Excellent. We all remember that, and we're going to continue not to put bats in our mouth. We also don't want to put frogs in our mouth. But one step more, we don't want to pick up frogs. Because they have this slimy mucus over their body, sometimes that's poisonous, and that's how they protect themselves. Sometimes it's just gross. You don't want to pick up a slimy thing, but they are excreting slimy things, but they're also absorbing so much. So if you have hand sanitizer or bug spray or sun cream on your hands and you touch a frog, they'll actually absorb that. And that's not good for the frogs. It can actually hurt them. So if you want to keep yourself safe, don't touch frogs, don't put them in your mouth. And if you want to keep the frogs safe, don't touch them. Also, don't put them in your mouth. So, oh my gosh, there's so many people that are sitting on the planet. These backgrounds are very cool. I am into them. So another really amazing thing about their skin, before I talk about the life cycle of a frog, because we have questions about tadpoles. Don't worry, I did too. But a really neat thing about frogs is that they shed their skin, kind of like a snake, but way cooler. Because they have to have dewy, glowy, amazing skin, they have to shed some of it. They can't just like get a loofah and like slough it off. So what they do is they let their skin get a little bit dry, and then they crouch down and they start moving around, and their skin will like kind of buckle and get wrinkly, and then it will rip. It doesn't hurt because it's old skin. It needs to come off. But then what they do is they get out of their skin, and they take their skin like a sweater and they take it off so they can have nice, again, dewy, lovely skin that can absorb all the water and the air and the nutrients that they need. Now, the crazy thing about it is frog skin, because it spends so much time absorbing, it absorbs this calcium and these nutrients and this protein. It's really, really sort of like a multivitamin that they make for themselves. So when they're done shedding their skin, they don't just throw it away, because that's silly. You made your own multivitamin. They eat it. Yum, 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 yum. I was expecting everyone to go, ew, but I guess everyone just really loves the natural world and thinks that's really cool, which it is. So that is super neat. So if you ever see a frog video or a frog in the wild that is getting rid of their skin, the reason that you don't find frog skin later is because they don't want predators to see that there's a frog around, and they don't want to waste all that protein. They just, shove it in their mouth and use their eyes to swallow it, which is pretty neat. So frogs. How do frogs have babies? It's pretty neat. I have some pictures to show you later, but it starts that, like I said, they have a big clump of eggs. The eggs are laid in water, and there's a big cloud of them that hangs out in water. It takes about 6 to 21 days. Remember, there's 400 different types of frogs out there. So it takes a while for those eggs to hatch. Now, when they hatch, they munch on little plants, and they munch on algae and things like that. They spend all their time in the water, so they actually are born with gills. And so when they hatch from their eggs, they are tadpoles, and those tadpoles breathe through their gills. They eat little algae. Oh my gosh, amazing pictures. Yes, excellent. Got some tadpoles, got some eggs, got some frogs. Oh, and I see another froggy on the screen. You guys always have such good props. I'm loving it. Now, after they are tadpoles, they swim around, they eat little algae, they breathe through the water like fish, but they're not done yet. They have to become frogs somehow. So when they are tadpoles, they're swimming around. Now remember, we all have different dances. We have the narwhal dance, we have the bat dance, we have the now tadpole dance. Everyone wants tadpole with me? Oh yeah, we got some tadpolers. All right, excellent, thank you. So after the tadpole dance, they're swimming around, and now it can take about 6 to 9 weeks that they become froglets, which is the cutest technical word. Froglets have tails, so they still look like tadpoles, but then they have legs, and they have arms as well. So they just look like the exact cross between a frog and a tadpole. After about another 12 weeks, they develop lungs, and their tail starts to shrink and their tail comes off, and then they are full frogs. So it's a really neat metamorphosis, almost, from egg to tadpole friend to little froglet to like actual frog jumping around doing its thing, which is cool. Now, we'll get to pictures in 1 second, but I have a super interesting fact about frogs that live in Alaska. So if you're a frog and you live in the forests or the jungles of Central America or Central Africa, there's so much water in the air and it's warm all year round. You don't have to hibernate. You just live your life. You just make little eggs. They turn into tadpoles. Those tadpoles into froglets. Froglets into frogs. You're great. But what if you're a frog in Alaska where it is cold a lot of the time? Well, I looked it up because I thought, what do they do? Well, frogs in Alaska, little wood frogs, shelter in place, just like us. So they don't migrate. There's not a mass migration of tons of frogs like going down to Florida to have a vacation. They dig a little hole in the ground and they hibernate for 7 months. Now they don't, oh my gosh, I see a little squirtle. Excellent. Now for 7 months, the reason they're able to do this is their body freezes almost completely. All their blood systems still work. They're still pumping blood, but they are hibernating. They basically fall asleep. And the really cool thing that their body does is their blood turns into mostly sugar. So they make their own antifreeze so they don't completely freeze. So they're almost frozen solid. About 2/3 of them is like pretty much ice. And then after 7 months, when everything melts around them, they wake up, they stretch the little frog bodies, they start hopping around to like go find some water to make eggs in. And they just pee out all that sugar. So as it turns out, frog pee in the spring would be very sweet. So there you go. I will show you guys some pictures now. We did have some questions about what a group of frogs is called. A group of frogs is an army, which I think would be the cutest army that would ever exist. We also have people that wanted to know the difference between, oh, there it is, share screen, the difference between male frogs and female frogs. Now, there's lots of differences and lots of different types of froggies. The main difference, though, is typically lady frogs are a lot bigger than dude frogs. So there's a lot of girl power out there. So this is a green frog, so handsome. You can see it's living in water, so it's nice and slimy. You can also see its back legs, super long, built for swimming, built for jumping really high. You can see its bulgy eyes that help it swallow. Now, this frog is a frog that I took a picture of in Costa Rica in the jungles of Central America. So it's not actually living in water, but it is living in a really damp hole, and that's where it gets a lot of its moisture from. The dirt and soil around it, they're able to absorb the moisture and the calcium and all the vitamins from the dirt. And here are some more frogs from Costa Rica. So you can see one is living right at a waterfall, and then one is living on a palm frond. Now, both of them live in areas that the air is really, really humid, so they're able to absorb a lot of moisture from the air. Now, you'll also be able to see that they are very colorful. So people asked about poisonous frogs. Now, all frogs excrete slime because the slime is going to help them absorb things, and it's nice to be slimy. But if a frog is very poisonous, then that is its defense mechanism, so it doesn't get eaten. So both these little guys, if a bird or a snake or something that eats frogs is around and it sees how colorful these frogs are, it goes, oh no, that is going to make me feel sick. I do not want to eat that. That's going to be poisonous. I'm going to leave it alone. And so sometimes animals want to be the same color as their environment to stay safe. Like bats, we learned last week, are dark colors to blend in with trees in the outside world. These frogs don't want to blend in. They want to say, hey, I am going to make you sick. Don't eat me. So here's a life cycle of the froggies. So you can see all of these eggs are in like a nice cloud kind of grouping. And then the second picture, I circled a froglet and a tadpole. So you can see how cool it is. There's tons of them living in this little pond. Sometimes one frog will lay 4,000 eggs. So you can think about how many eggs that is how many tadpoles, how many froglets, how many frogs are just in the backyard. And so it's pretty neat to see all these different tadpoles looking all these different ways and turning into little froggies. And the bottom picture is a spring peeper. It's what we hear in North America quite often when we just hear like choruses of frogs just singing in the evening. Those are spring peepers. They're quite little guys. And here's the last picture. This is another picture that I took in Costa Rica. I'm just showing off my photography skills. But you can see this little guy lives in a plant where there's lots of dew around. So like I said before, they don't have to be near a huge water source. You can see that, yeah, perfect, right there. You can see that these little droplets of water, which would be so little to us, are actually like quite big for a little frog friend. So those are my frog pictures. Before we ask any questions, I'm going to tell you the biggest frog in the world and the smallest frog in the world. So the biggest frog in the world is called the Goliath frog, giant. The Goliath frog lives in Central Africa, in Cameroon, and they, from snout to butt, can be 32 centimeters or 13 inches. So that's bigger than a ruler. So that's real big. And they can be 3.5 kilograms, which is just over 7 pounds of frog. And the smallest species in the whole world is from Papua New Guinea, and they are called Paeodiphrygmi amenensis. That's how you say it. And they are so little. Remember the Indonesian bumblebee bat last week? That was the size of my thumb. Well, this little guy can fit on my thumbnail. So if it was friends with the Indonesian bumblebee bat, it could ride the Indonesian bumblebee bat to like go see flowers and get other nutrients. But as consent is important, you would have to ask if it's okay. And the Indonesian bumblebee bat would be like, sure, it's totally fine. So those are all my frog facts for right now, but does anyone have any questions for the last couple minutes of animal chat time?
What percentage of like frog eggs actually grow up to be frogs? Like how many get eaten?
Oh, yeah, actually that's a really good question. So it depends a lot on the frogs, and this is why frogs have 4,000 eggs. A lot of frogs are in different areas are endangered because there's less and less habitat for them. So it's not so much that the frog eggs and the tadpoles are getting eaten, it's that there's not a lot of space for them. We have less forests and less wetlands. So the percentage from eggs to tadpoles to full frogs is sometimes as high as 50%. And sometimes it can be quite low. But it typically isn't that they're getting eaten, it's just they need a lot more space. Oh my gosh, that is an excellent frog picture. Good work.
Do frogs have and toads have bumpy backs?
Oh, Carla, that's a great question. They do have bumpy backs. Now, toads will have, so frogs and toads don't have warts. So that is like a common misconception. They're not warty, but they are bumpy. And a lot of them are really bumpy because they, toads especially, want to blend in with their environment. And so they're not super bright. They're not showing off like, hey, I'm here, but I'm also poisonous. A lot of frogs that have the bumpy backs are, they're bumpy because they're not poisonous. And so they want to like blend in with a tree. So they go like, hey, I'm really bumpy because I'm just a tree. You don't want to eat a tree, friend. It's a good question.
What is the most poisonous kind of frog?
I I knew we were going to talk about this. So the most poisonous frogs that are in the world are different poison dart frogs. They are in Central and South America, and it's all through their skin. And this is why we don't want to touch any frogs, because it's not like they bite you and that's how you can get sick or you get poisoned. They are so brightly colored. It's the bright colored ones that are poison. And the poison dart frogs are the ones that even if you were to touch it, you would absorb some of the poison, and you don't want to do that. You can get really sick if you touched it and then you touched your eye would not work. So you just want to leave them alone. But poison dart frogs are the frog. Well, we want to leave all frogs alone, but those are the ones that will make you sick.
There is a question in the chat.
Oh.
How many species of frogs are endangered?
So there are 400 frogs on the whole planet that we know about, and about 200 of them are endangered right now. So about half of them. And like I said before, that's because there's less habitat for them. So the best way to protect them, the best way to help frogs is not only to leave them alone, but also to really stick up for our wetlands and make sure that there are wetlands around. We have lots of old growth forests and lots of places for them to live. They've lived on this planet for millions of years, so they're really good at living in their environments. We just have to make sure their environments stay safe.
Nora, what country is frogs mostly in?
Ooh.
What country has the most frogs? Yeah.
What country has the most frogs? You know, I don't actually know. I would think, though, the most frogs would live in a place that have the most habitat. So it would be in like really big jungles. So probably somewhere in like South America or in Central or West Africa, where you see lots of unexplored places, lots of places where people don't live. That's going to be where the most amount of frogs are. But that's a really good question. And I think that's so great. Like we don't know everything about, well, I don't know anything about everything. But even in science, we don't know everything about frogs. And so it's so great to have these questions so we can say, I want to be a frogologist when I grow up and see where the most amount of frogs are.